Okay. All right, let's get started. Good morning. On behalf of the Wilmington City, Sister Cities Association, I'd like to welcome you to this morning's program on the path to carbon neutrality. My name is Larry Cahoon. I'll be the moderator. I'm a professor of biology and marine biology at UNC Wilmington. We have 4 speakers today. I will introduce each one of them just before they get up to speak. Each speaker will have 10 minutes. We'll proceed through all 4 presentations, and then we'll have time for questions. And folks who are listening in on Zoom can ask their questions in the chat. They will be relayed to me, and I will pose them to the panelists. If you have a question for a particular panelist, please indicate that. And please also put your name and your representation on your question so that we know who you are and who you represent. Without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. Carly Lohan is the Southeastern Wind Coalition Program and Outreach Manager. The Southeastern Wind Coalition's mission is to advance the wind industry in ways that result in net economic benefits to industries, utilities, ratepayers, and residents in the Southeast. The Southeastern Wind Coalition is a 501c3 nonprofit that works to advance wind energy in the Southeast through an objective, data-driven, and economic development-focused approach to ensure the Southeast can take advantage of this clean, cost-efficient generation source. Carly serves on the North Carolina Wind Task Force for Offshore Wind Economic Resource Strategies. Carly?
Thank you, Dr. Cahoon. And thank you for the introduction. We'll just give it a second for my slides to get set up here. Awesome, thank you. So as Dr. Cahoon mentioned, my name is Carly Lohan. I am the Program and Outreach Manager for the Southeastern Wind Coalition. I'm based in Wilmington, North Carolina, and work pretty exclusively in North Carolina and in offshore wind. And just to give you a little background, again, our mission is to focus on outreach and education to advance the wind industry in the Southeast. We like to say that we are advocates for the wind industry, but we're also advocates for the stakeholders of the Southeast. We have an 11-state footprint, but right now I'm focused exclusively on North Carolina and the economic benefits that offshore wind offers to our state. I'm going to start off by giving you just a little bit of a history and evolution of offshore wind. And really the purpose of this slide is just to demonstrate to you that offshore wind, while it is a new technology in the United States, has been around for quite a while. We saw the first project built off the coast of Denmark in 1991, and the driver of this was really energy independence. And it was more similar to the projects that we see off the coast of the single project that we see off the coast of the United States right now, in the sense that it was a pilot project. And again, the driver was energy independence, and they were looking for protection against fluctuating fuel prices and wanted to see how they could move forward with the industry. In the late 90s, commercial scale development really started to kick off, and there was a big focus on cost decline and efficiency and how to make the technology cost competitive to other energy generation technologies. And then now we see more than 35 gigawatts of offshore wind deployed worldwide. It's important to note that most of that is in the UK and Asia. We actually only have 7 turbines off the coast of the United States right now, but we have 25 projects in various stages of development. And just to give you a little bit of an evolution of the utility scale turbine, this diagram shows how the onshore turbines have evolved and how offshore turbines have evolved. As I mentioned, we have 7 turbines off the coast of the United States. 5 of them are off the coast of Block Island, Rhode Island, and they're smaller turbines, about 590 feet, but this next wave of projects will be closer to 853 feet tall, and that's about the size of a US football field. But the purpose behind larger turbines is cost decline and efficiency. The larger turbine means greater efficiency. It makes the energy that we get from those turbines less variable and more reliable. And it's also important to note that with larger turbines, we can generate more energy with the same project footprint. I like to show this map because it represents the various 25 projects in various stages of development across the coast. I really like to mention here that the driver for state procurement goals has really been the clean energy and carbon reduction goals that we're seeing across the state. And it's really important to note that while North Carolina has a great opportunity for offshore wind, there are a lot of states that are in the same boat and are really making their best case to various parts of the industry with open arms for those companies to come set up shop and invest privately in whether it's ports or manufacturing facilities or various infrastructure related to offshore wind. And this map on the right just shows some of the projects in various stages of development. I'm going to talk a little bit now about why offshore wind and why North Carolina has an advantage for offshore wind. I like to talk about these 6 points when I'm talking to coastal communities. North Carolina has the highest offshore wind resource potential on the East Coast, as you can see on this map on the left. That doesn't necessarily mean that offshore wind has the highest winds or the best winds, but it's a combination of factors. We have very long, shallow coastlines and partnered with our wind speeds. That makes a really great resource potential. Also, North Carolina, as we know, prides itself on its manufacturing workforce. We've got a world-class university and community college system that is gearing up to support the workforce transition to offshore wind. We've also got 2 great ports at the Port of Morehead City and the Port of Wilmington that can support various stages of offshore wind life cycles, whether that's staging, manufacturing, marshaling, and it can also support projects beyond the North Carolina projects. We've also got 55 plus existing land-based wind and supply chain companies in North Carolina, I should say. These are companies that already function in the manufacturing supply chain for land-based wind, and there are even more companies that have expressed interest in transitioning their work to support offshore wind manufacturing. And something that's really important to note here that I forgot to note on my earlier slide when I showed the transition or the evolution of offshore wind turbines, the tier 1 components, which are the components you see, the blades, the nacelle, the tower, the foundation, those are huge components, again, 853 feet tall when they're all together. Those large components have to be manufactured on the coast. But there are also smaller components that can be manufactured throughout the state. There are 8,000 components in a wind turbine, which is something that most people don't know. But this map right here shows installed capacity for offshore wind. And even though we don't have a ton of installed capacity in North Carolina, these red dots represent active wind-related manufacturing facilities. And again, this is a really great opportunity to bring manufacturing and economic development to places beyond the coast. But what's really important to remember too is those large components do need to be manufactured on the coast, and we do have a great opportunity with our ports, a unique opportunity with our ports, the way that they're laid out and structured to support offshore wind specifically. And again, these are just a few components. That's a blade on the left. The middle picture is also the inside of a blade before it was completed, and the picture on the right is a tower. So huge components, again, need to be manufactured on the coast. Some of the benefits that I like to talk about when I talk about offshore wind are grid resiliency and diversity. Offshore wind is very complementary to has a very complementary generation profile to other energy resources, and it contributes to a more diverse grid, especially in times of high load demand. I know that most people are aware that we experienced rolling blackouts on Christmas Eve that affected over 500,000 Americans. Avangrid, which is the developer of the Kitty Hawk wind energy area, was able to pull some meteorological data from the time of those blackouts. We had about an 1,100 megawatt deficit during the time of those blackouts, and because we are not part of an RTO and we are part of a vertically integrated monopoly utility system, we did not have other places we could borrow power from. The Kitty Hawk wind energy area would have created about 1,300 megawatts of power, so just a little bit more than what we needed to meet that deficit. So having a variety of resources is really important for grid resiliency and diversity, and offshore wind has a great opportunity there. Energy independence is another great benefit that I like to communicate to coastal communities. It's a homegrown energy resource. It's not something that will fluctuate with commodity prices. Again, there's a huge opportunity for workforce development, and there's a growing pipeline of projects. These potential jobs and workforce development opportunities that could support the North Carolina projects will also be able to support projects up and down the coast. It's a source of carbon-free energy, and I know we're talking about decarbonizing our grid. Offshore wind generates electricity without burning any fuel or emitting any carbon dioxide. And we know that carbon-free energy is going to be necessary to protect coastal communities, and a lot of our states, as well as our federal government, have set some really aggressive and great goals for decarbonization. But again, a variety of resource is what is going to be needed to get us there. There's a lot of question on the coast about how offshore wind can impact tourism. And it's really important to note that in Block Island, Rhode Island, they actually saw a 19% occupancy increase and a $3,500 annual rental income after the installation of turbines. So I think there's a really great opportunity for ecotourism related to offshore wind. And I did want to note that SEWC and our partners at Environmental Entrepreneurs, or E2, conducted a hypothetical cost-benefit analysis that modeled a 2.8 gigawatt project, which is about the size of Kitty Hawk Wind, in operation by 2030, and it found about $4.6 billion in net economic impact. And I'm just very quickly going to give you a brief overview. We've got Kitty Hawk Wind off the coast of Corolla, North Carolina. That's about 122,000 acres and will be estimated to support 2.5 gigawatts. It's 27 miles offshore, and right now the first phase is looking at transmission routes coming onshore in Virginia Beach. And our Carolina Long Bay project, which is closer to home off the coast of Brunswick County, is a little bit smaller. The conservative estimate is that it'll support about 1.6 gigawatts, but it'll probably support a little bit more than that, and that's enough energy to power 750,000 homes on the conservative side. This is 20 miles from Bald Head Island, so it's a little bit closer in terms of visual impact, but you would have to really have perfect conditions to see turbines on an average beach day in the summer. And this project is still very early on. We're about a decade away from any construction and operation. And here's my contact information if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly. Our next speaker is joining us remotely from England. He is Justin Swan, and he is a commercial analyst with the Banks Group, a family business founded in 1976 and headquartered in West Yorkshire, England, with 4 locations, including one in Scotland. The company started as a small surface mining operator and is an example of how businesses adapt, given that the company is now one of the leading renewables development operators in the UK. Justin's focus has been on newer technologies in addition to standalone battery storage. He studies the commercial viability of pumped storage, peaking plants, hydrogen, and co-location of batteries with solar and wind. On the Thorpe Marsh Green Energy Hub in Doncaster, he has been focused on the commercial and financial analysis of the project.
Thank you very much for having me. Let me just share my screen quickly. Right. I hope you can all see that. So as mentioned, I'm here to talk about battery storage and how it's going to help the transition to carbon neutrality, and then talk about the Thorpe Marsh Green Energy Hub, which is a project we are working on. So getting into it, I'll first go into why battery storage is required, and then I'll move on to the project. So the 2 main uses for battery storage on the grid, there's 2 categories really. There's more subcategories, but I'll keep it high level, and that's energy shifting and grid stability. So energy shifting is probably what you would typically think of when you think of battery storage on the grid. So that's storing energy when there's excess generation, and then discharging it when there's high demand and low generation, particularly renewables generation, which, as we know, fluctuates. So this graph looks a little bit complicated, but it's a sample day in the UK, and your red line there is the wholesale energy price. Your green bars are where the battery would be charging, and your blue bars are where the battery would be discharging. So you can see that overnight, the battery will typically charge up when demand is very low, and your renewables generation might be in excess or providing much of the power needed. So the battery charges up, and then the energy demand ramps up in the morning as everyone wakes up and industry starts, and the battery may discharge there. Then in summer, what we typically see is we see a drop in demand and solar generation, particularly in the summer, and through the middle of the day, and you get the price dropping again, so the battery can recharge. And then in the evening in the UK, when everyone gets home to make a cup of tea, there's a spike in demand, and the battery can discharge again and meet that peak demand. And so this is important. And as we transition away from fossil fuel generation, which is typically flexible and would currently meet these fluctuations in demand and supply, we need a short duration form of storage that can meet this. So why batteries for this? Well, firstly, batteries, in particular lithium-ion batteries, have extremely good round-trip efficiencies, the best pretty much of any commercial storage technology. It's getting up to about 90%. So that just means you're wasting less of the energy that you use to charge up the battery. And then the second is the cost of the actual batteries themselves, which over the last decade has dropped significantly due to the investment in electric vehicles and consumer electronics. And it's the exact same technology basically that gets used in these grid scale batteries. And they're the lowest cost form of storage, up to if you need to discharge for about 4 to 6 hours. Anything less than that, lithium ion is about the cheapest form of storage at the moment. The next major use is grid stability, which is inherently a bit technical, but I'll keep it as high level as possible. The main thing we're talking about is frequency. So that's how quickly the electrons are oscillating in your wires, and that on the electrical grid, that needs to be kept in a very narrow band to prevent issues with the grid. So what basically happens is if you have a large generation plant that suddenly drops off the grid for some reason, or you have a large demand that suddenly comes on the grid, you get a sudden drop in grid frequency. And you need something to replace that generation or make up that sudden increase in demand to keep the frequency within the tolerable range. So again, why batteries? Well, as we transition away from thermal generations, that's coal power stations and gas generators, which are big, large spinning machines, they keep an inertia on the grid. And as we move away from that, the grid will become less stable. So changes in demand and generation will cause bigger fluctuations in frequency. So we need something that can maintain that frequency and keep it in the operational range. And batteries are ideal for that because they can respond extremely quickly, faster than any other technology that ramps up and down. We in the UK have something called the dynamic frequency markets, and that's entirely supplied by batteries because of how quickly they can ramp up. There's nothing else that can meet the requirements, basically. So that's going to become more and more important as we transition to net zero. And here's a forecast from National Grid ESO, who's our energy system operator in Great Britain. And they forecast by 2050 that we're going to need somewhere between 30 and 50 gigawatts of battery storage, energy storage to meet net zero. And at the moment, we've got about 3 gigawatts operational on the grid. About 2 and a bit of that is battery storage, and less than 1 gigawatt is pumped hydro storage. So we need a huge build out of it. I'll quickly go over the project now. I'll just call it Thought Marsh for short. But this is the site. So the site is just located north of Doncaster in Barnby Dun, and it's next to an old coal power station that's now decommissioned, and the towers there are actually demolished now. To the west of the site, you've got a nature reserve, which is owned by the Banks Group too, and that's not going to be affected by the project. Well, it's going to be enhanced in coordination with the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. And then to the north of the site, there's a disused rail connection. And then on the site, we've got what in its current state is a waste product, pulverized fuel ash that forms a horseshoe around the bottom of the site. and that's a waste from the old coal power station. So what we plan to do with it, firstly, we plan to recommission the railhead on the site, and that's going to transport the majority of materials to and from the site, because the local road network is not built to withstand a high volume of HGVs. So the railhead will be able to bypass a lot of the HGV movements on the local road network. Currently, there is a market, and if the market holds for pulverized fuel ash, we plan to extract the PFA from the site, process it, and then it can be sold as an additive for a number of uses, but mostly in cement. So if that holds and the timelines work out, we plan to extract that and use it for a productive purpose. And then we plan to install this battery on the site, which you can see a schematic of. It's a bit hard to get your head around what that means. So 1.4 gigawatts or 2.8 gigawatt hours. So that's a 1.4 gigawatt battery that can discharge continuously for 2 hours. And if built today, that would make it the largest battery in the world. We don't know whether something bigger is going to be built in between now and when this gets constructed. But at the moment, it's about 14 times the size of the biggest battery currently operational in the UK. It could power about 1.6 million homes in the UK during peak consumption. So peak times 4 to 6 in the evening. The battery could power about 7% of England and Wales households. So it's an enormous project and would be fantastic. It will also sort of deliver an annual community benefit package that will help support local projects and initiatives. And it's a really exciting project that we all looking forward to building out. So thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Justin. We'll continue right away. Our next speaker is John Ball. He is currently the Executive Vice President, Market Development Leader for GE Hitachi Nuclear Energy, based here in Wilmington. They are a world-leading provider of advanced reactors, fuel, and nuclear services. GEH is an alliance created by GE and Hitachi to serve the global nuclear industry. The alliance combines GE's design expertise and history delivering reactors, fuels, and services globally with Hitachi's proven experience in advanced modular construction to offer customers around the world the technological leadership required to effectively enhance reactor performance, power output, and safety. GEH operates training facilities in Wilmington, North Carolina, and San Jose, California. Global Nuclear Fuel, GNF, a GE-led joint venture, operates fuel manufacturing facilities in Wilmington and Kurihama, Japan. GNF, through a joint venture with EN USA, markets fuel for plants in Europe that is manufactured at a facility in Husbado, Spain. Mr. Ball.
Thank you for the introduction, and it's great to be part of this dialogue. What I thought I would do is really talk about, number one, why nuclear. I have some facts that aren't widely known by the general public. I'll talk a little bit about what we do and the history of GE and the nuclear industry, and then a little bit about our new small modular reactor, which is a cutting-edge technology where we're gaining significant traction and interest in the global market. Go to the next page, please. So, first of all, nuclear is a carbon-free emission source, and today provides over 50% of all clean energy produced in the United States. And specifically, GE's nuclear technology, which is designed and supported right here out of Wilmington, North Carolina, provides over 20% of all the clean power generation today in the United States. One of the benefits of nuclear is the fact that it's a very energy dense source. So as an example, a uranium pellet, which we manufacture just a few miles from here, up the Cape Fear River near Castle Hayne, a pellet, which is roughly the size of a pencil eraser or the tip of your pinky, provides the equivalent energy as a ton of coal, nearly 150 gallons of oil, or 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas. Now that's important when it comes to the land usage in which nuclear utilizes. And I'm drawing some comparisons with wind and solar, and the point of making some of the comparisons that I'm going to show you aren't to communicate that it's nuclear versus wind or solar. We believe that to reach a decarbonized planet, that we need all energy solutions that are carbon-free. But if you look at the energy density of nuclear, it's a little dot you can see there, and this is to provide the equivalent power to power 6 million homes, roughly 100 times the energy density of both solar and wind. And then, often a concern or a question, I should say, that comes up is about the waste that nuclear generates. And, it turns out that if you were to take every atom of nuclear waste that's been generated since the 1950s here in the United States, and you piled that into an area the size of a football field, it would only equate to a depth of 24 feet. Now, the good news is that we know where every atom of nuclear waste that's ever been generated, we know specifically where it is, and it's been safely stored, in some cases for decades, in highly engineered canisters. Ultimately, there's work to create other uses or storage approaches, but there's also nuclear technology that's available that can take this waste and actually burn it or consume it as a fuel source. So turning what we once thought was waste into an asset. Another major advantage of nuclear is the fact that it's always on. And these are comparisons of the capacity factors. And so, if you think about severe weather events, or in many cases of droughts, wind and solar, which are going to be very important, again, to decarbonize the planet, depend on either the wind blowing or the sun shining. And so nuclear is always on, and when it's not, it's going through a standard routine refueling outage. This is very important when you think about energy security. And besides nuclear being very important in terms of decarbonizing the planet, it's also becoming essential, especially in Europe, especially in the UK, Central Eastern Europe, where there is an energy crisis today that's largely been driven by Russia's aggression into Ukraine. So there's an intense need to sever that region from dependence on Russian gas, and nuclear provides an ideal solution from an energy security standpoint. This is some data on greenhouse gas emissions, and this is across the life cycle of a technology. And so nuclear, you can see, is roughly the same as hydroelectric and wind. When you manufacture these different power generation sources, there is some carbon intensity, whether it be the need for concrete and construction materials. So there is a small amount of carbon across all generation sources, but once they're operating, just like wind and like solar, nuclear is carbon-free. And then on the right-hand side, the safety aspects of nuclear are unparalleled. These are fatality rates across all power generation sources, and nuclear is orders of magnitude safer than all other sources of power. So shifting now to a little bit about GE's nuclear business, we actually got involved in the dawn of the industry and helped pioneer the commercial nuclear industry, both here in the U.S. And in Canada. We formed our atomic energy division back in the 1950s. Just 2 years later, we actually had the very first nuclear plant that was synced to the grid. This is the Vallecito boiling water reactor, which was located just outside of Silicon Valley in California. 5 years later, we also were part of a team that deployed the very first reactor in Canada. And since then, we've been deploying, for the last several decades, 67 reactors licensed in 10 different countries. We believe that the future of nuclear is in small modular reactors, and that's what I'm going to talk about going forward. And a key milestone on this page is on the right-hand side, shown in red, and that this was our technology being selected, the very first global commercial competition for a grid-scale small modular reactor. Ontario Power Generation selected us. And since then, we've really seen a snowball effect and have actually captured every commercial competition so far to date, just based on the technological advances of our SMR. A little bit about it. BWR X300 is the name of the reactor. We tend to use acronyms in the nuclear industry. BWR stands for Boiling Water Reactor. That's what we are experts in at General Electric. The X stands for 10th generation boiling water reactor. So this is a proven technology building on decades of prior design and licensing pedigree. The 300 denotes the output, so 300 megawatts electric. Highly innovative, proven world-class safety. This will be the safest design that we've deployed to date. Essentially can shut itself down without any operator intervention and can do so for several days without the need for off-site power or operators. I mentioned already, 10th generation. The innovative aspect, we have really taken all of our prior decades of design expertise, and we've created the simplest, most cost-effective design through some new innovations that have enabled this much higher level of safety as well. And it's allowed us to eliminate a significant amount of concrete and construction materials. And so, although we are going smaller in design, this will actually be more cost-effective on a per megawatt basis than the large reactors. And we've experienced significant interest in the global market. I mentioned Ontario Power Generation in Canada, and really started there. They did a 2-year evaluation, and there is such tremendous interest in nuclear technology today to really solve these big world problems that there were over 100 designs that Ontario Power Generation evaluated. At the end of the 2-year review process, we emerged as the winners. And I mentioned that it's been really a snowball effect in terms of the level of interest. Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States has selected our technology. By the way, in Canada, we've submitted a construction application that's under review. That plant will be operational by 2028. In Poland, we have a partnership with Orlen Synthos Green Energy that has announced the need for 79 of these small modular reactors, and then tremendous interest around the world. And I do want to point out the UK, because leading market development, that is where I have spent the majority of my time. This is a country that has established a great vision, 24 gigawatts by 2050. We believe that we're going to be an ideal solution for that market. So we've really been working with supply chain partners to help establish our presence in the UK and create a potential manufacturing center of excellence that we can then leverage in the global market, especially markets like Poland that have such a tremendous need for SMRs. And then recently, just a couple weeks ago, we had a major announcement in Washington, D.C. with 3 of our partners, Tennessee Valley Authority, Ontario Power Generation, and Synthos Green Energy out of Poland. These partners came together to co-fund $400 million of remaining development work to complete our detailed design. This is unprecedented, where you have 2 major utilities in North America, TVA and OPG, coming together with a major industrial company in Poland, Synthos, to accelerate and ensure that we have a standard design that can be used, that can be deployed in both North America and Europe. So very enthusiastic about the prospects of this technology, and we are in the process now of deploying it in a time frame that we believe will have a big impact not only on decarbonization but energy security. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Our next and final speaker is Justin Sosney. He currently serves as head of the UK government's North Carolina office, which is based in Raleigh. In this capacity, Justin serves as the British government's lead political and commercial representative to the state of North Carolina, his home state. He also currently serves as co-chair of the North Carolina Task Force for Offshore Wind Economic Resource Strategies, NC Towers, and part of the Economic Opportunity Committee within that task force. Justin's prior professional experience includes working for 7 years as Vice President and Senior Director at Bauer Group Asia, BGA, a leading Asia-focused government affairs consulting firm, leading diplomatic policy and programmatic efforts designed to empower women and girls globally, particularly around combating climate change, in the U.S. Department of State's Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, participating in the Coro Fellowship in Public Affairs in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and finally conducting research on United Nations peacekeeping at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, Germany. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Cahoon, and to Wilmington Sister Cities for having me today. It's great to be with all of you this morning. So energy, and particularly renewable energy, is currently at the top of the UK's political agenda for many of the reasons that have already been mentioned this morning. For example, Putin's weaponization of energy has shown how we need to be less reliant on imported fossil fuels. The UK's new Department for Energy Security and Net Zero's mission is to replace these with cheap, clean, secure British energy sources. The UK will be increasingly powered by renewables, including the technologies that have been mentioned, wind and solar, hydrogen, power with carbon capture, usage and storage, or CCUS, and new nuclear plants, and particularly small modular reactors like those by GE Hitachi. So it's important to note that in our view, energy security and net zero are really two sides of the same coin. There's no longer any tension between securing energy supply, cutting carbon, and low prices. The energy security mission underpins our clean energy transition, so the UK becomes a net zero economy by 2050. Just last month, the UK released a comprehensive energy strategy called Powering Up Britain, which contains many more details. I'd be more than happy to share that by way of follow-up to this presentation. But it's clear that the UK can't achieve its clean energy goals without engaging in diplomacy and in partnership building. As we all know, markets transcend political boundaries, and ultimately the Earth systems don't care if 1 gigaton of CO2 is released in Lumberton or in London. So here in North Carolina, we as the UK government are partnering very closely with our counterparts, including both the Cooper administration and the legislature and many others across academia and the private sector, to advance our shared net zero ambitions. In July 2022, Governor Cooper signed a memorandum of understanding with then UK Trade Minister Penny Mordaunt that sets out mutual goals and activities to strengthen our economic ties in the clean energy transition. It provides a framework to address trade barriers, increase investment, and enhance business networks. It also supports efforts to address climate change by seeking to accelerate the deployment of clean energy and technology. So what does that look like, though, in practice, beyond simply words on a piece of paper? So offshore wind, Carly has already very helpfully laid out, but it's a great example for where there's real opportunity for partnership between the UK and North Carolina. The UK has 20 plus years experience in this space and has recently doubled down on our commitment with a highly ambitious goal of developing up to 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. In November of this past year, of 2022, 12 UK experts in offshore wind with expertise in areas as diverse as ports, fisheries, supply chain development, and more spent a week in North Carolina, including a day and a half in Wilmington, where they shared best practices and also lessons learned. They talked about how they don't want folks here to make the same mistakes that the UK perhaps made along the way as they forged the way in offshore wind. And as has been mentioned, both in my introduction and also alluded to in Carly, I represent the UK government on the Governor's Commission on offshore wind, and am very keen to find opportunities to build relationships and establish supply chain connections between the UK and North Carolina as the industry develops here in the States. So just a few other examples. In February this year, the UK Secretary of Food, Environment and Rural Affairs, so think EPA, FDA, and Department of Agriculture essentially all rolled into one, visited North Carolina for the first time to explore potential collaborations in ag tech. And then in March, the mayor of Greater Manchester, the UK's second largest metro, visited North Carolina to explore trade investment opportunities across the board, but including in clean energy. So looking ahead, we have a delegation of UK motorsports companies who are doing innovative work on hydrogen and energy efficiency, which essentially is their core business, visiting the Charlotte region next month. And in June, I'll be leading a delegation of North Carolina officials, academic administrators, and companies to Manchester, Liverpool, and North Wales to explore the intersection of workforce development and smart mobility. So I would say the bottom line is that in an uncertain and increasingly turbulent world, we have to deepen partnerships in order to build the future that we all want to see. And given the need to reinvent so many industries and innovate across so many sectors, we have an unprecedented opportunity to open doors to populations, both socioeconomic and geographic, that may have previously been marginalized. But partnerships at the state and local level in particular are critical, as this is really where the rubber hits the road. So thank you for all that you're doing in Wilmington and beyond, and again, for the opportunity to be with you today.
Okay, thank you, Justin. At this time, we'll entertain questions from the live audience as well as the Zoom audience. For those who have questions from the Zoom audience, please put them in the chat, and those questions will be relayed to me. In the meantime, if members of the live audience have questions, please ask me and state your name and who you represent, and I'll repeat the question for those who are online. George, do we have any questions in the chat? We don't. Well, then I have to put on my thinking cap. How about folks in the audience? These good people have come a long way to do this for us. So, Marilyn? Yeah, go ahead and use the mic. That will help us all hear you.
So my question had to do with the financing of these projects, which no one really addressed in terms of, are they private investments? Are they publicly financed through tax dollars? You know, what is the plan for, you know, this is a long-term investment and a very expensive one, whether it be renewables, battery storage, or nuclear.
Right, so the essence of the question from Marilyn Cantrell is the source of financing for each of these projects. I'll invite any of the panelists who wants to go first and just let me know.
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
John, okay.
I can take a first cut. Let me just mention, I'll talk about the lead plant that we're deploying in Canada with Ontario Power Generation. Ontario Power Generation is a Crown corporation, but they do generate revenue, as many utilities do in the U.S. From ratepayers. The actual project itself is being financed by the federal government and the Ontario government. So there was an announcement maybe a few months ago that the Canadian Infrastructure Bank has put up $1 billion toward the project, and then the balance is being made up by the Ontario government and OPG. So the project right now is fully funded. What I would say in the nuclear industry right now, as these projects are being, especially the first ones in each country, you're seeing heavy government support to help eliminate first-of-a-kind costs that come with any new deployment in a particular country. Great example, the UK, right now they have a future nuclear enabling fund that we have applied for that will help, and we're waiting to hear back on the outcome of that application, but that will provide the initial funding to go get through the licensing process. And then we anticipate that the establishment of Great British Nuclear, which was announced just a couple weeks ago officially, they too will help provide funding in the early phases of nuclear deployment, again to overcome some of the first-of-a-kind risks and costs. Once these projects are demonstrated or deployed in each of these countries, then after those first-of-a-kind costs have been retired, these are highly investable projects, and so we believe that really the private sector and investment will take over from that point forward.
Okay, anyone else want to tackle that one?
Yep, I'm happy to jump in. That's a great question. So the actual construction and operation of the projects is at the hands of the developers, but there are a lot of federal incentives, specifically through IRA, with the production tax credit and the investment tax credit. And those have all kinds of components, which I actually have a sheet here that I can share with you. But they have credits that apply to different components and manufacturing offshore wind vessels. They can support inverter production needed to convert the electricity. But essentially, these tax credits, there's the ITC and PTC, the Advanced Manufacturing Tax Credit, and the Advanced Energy Project Tax Credit, all part of IRA. They have very specific requirements, whether those are domestic content or prevailing wage, things like that. So there's still a lot of unknown how those are going to function to support the industry. We also expect to see a lot of private partnership. We already have a lot of companies coming to North Carolina and knocking on the door and asking, if we're ramping up, whether it's our ports or other infrastructure or workforce, manufacturing, whatever it may be. I think the biggest cost issue for residents right now is transmission upgrades. There's going to have to be a lot of transmission upgrades associated with offshore wind, both with onshoring and actually just upgrading our grid to support that much power coming from the coast and going inland, because historically all of our power has been manufactured in the middle of the state and gone outwards. That's a little bit of a different conversation, but I can say that there are a lot of needs for proactive transmission planning before we can really put a price tag on that, both to reduce the cost to ratepayers, but also the environmental impacts. But I can say that there are also federal incentives related to that. So a lot of those are also through IRA, and some of them have been given the green light through the carbon plan. So we're trying to see what, through the carbon plan, Duke Energy has been directed to start to explore those federal incentives before they kind of move forward with just upgrades that would impact ratepayers.
Okay, do we have any other comments about that question? Justin?
Well,
You sure?
specify.
Sorry, other Justin.
Yeah, Justin Sosny.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I would just say that the UK is very committed to mobilizing private investment. So UK government has an updated green finance strategy, which includes maximizing the impact of the UK's public financing institutions. For example, the UK Infrastructure Bank is capitalized at $22 billion. The strategy also sets out the UK's pathway to become the world's first net zero aligned financial center. So working to equip the market with the information and tools necessary to meet the goal. And then as a follow-up to the UK's presidency of COP26, which was held in Glasgow last year before last, the UK is committed to 11.6 billion in global climate financing to contribute toward adaptation and the overall global goal of 100 billion over the next 5 years.
Justin Swan, did you have a response as well?
Yes, sure. I'll just add a bit of context to the UK perspective. The core technologies here, so wind and solar, at this stage now are completely privately funded. There are revenue support mechanisms that are available, but these aren't sort of subsidies. It's typically fixing prices over the lifetime of a project, but that doesn't mean it's any higher than the market rate. It just guarantees a revenue, a price for the energy that you sell, which makes it easier to raise debt on projects and that sort of thing. So there's price support mechanisms, but it's not a subsidy whatsoever. It's there were subsidies in the early stages of renewables development, and there continues to be subsidies for new technologies that we think are critical to reaching net zero. But as they gain in their commercial viability, it moves away from the subsidy into just privately funded. Batteries they don't have any support mechanisms or government financing. It's all done entirely privately and just earning their revenues in the markets.
All right, thank you. Do we have other questions from the live audience? We have one. Do we have a microphone we can share? All right, thank you.
Thanks. Hello. Yeah, my name's Jim. I have a question specifically about the nuclear power in the U.S. And is there anything more on timing with the TVA site? I didn't really catch when you anticipated that would go. And then what's the follow-on after there? Is there a queue, or is it everything dependent on this one in TVA?
Let me repeat that for the benefit of the Zoom audience. The question, as I understood it, was about the timing of deployment of these new reactors.
Yeah, so specifically in Tennessee at the Tennessee Valley Authority. And we are working today under contract to develop what's called a construction permit application. And that will be submitted to the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission either at the end of this year, early next year, largely leveraging a lot of the lessons with the Canadian application, which is essentially equivalent conceptually, slightly different regulations, but largely the same. Their goal is to be operational in the early 2030s. That said, we are in discussions with numerous U.S. utilities. The size of this reactor is ideal for coal replacement, and so especially in the southeast part of the United States, there's a number of very large regulated utilities that have large fleets of coal that ultimately will be retired. And so we're in discussions with several about some fairly substantial potential fleets of these reactors. So it's possible that it's not a slam dunk, I would say, that Tennessee Valley Authority will be operational first. Right now, it's the first one out of the gate in terms of developing a construction permit application. I didn't mention IRA when we were talking about some of the funding sources, but nuclear is eligible for these IRA credits in a number of different ways, which can be substantial. And so just the overall interest in the U.S. Is being accelerated by the IRA. Aside from standard utilities, the other part of the market that I didn't talk about is the industrial world. So power generation is just one piece of our economy that we need to decarbonize. But there's industrial heat and industrial processes that today rely largely on coal generation to produce high temperature steam and heat for chemical and other industrial processes. And so there's great interest in talking with these companies, very large industrial companies that are household names, that will be new to nuclear, new entrants into the nuclear space, because what they recognize is it's impossible to decarbonize those operations because they depend on the power being on all the time. And only nuclear can provide that and the decarbonized energy source that they require. So you're going to see announcements in the U.S. in the coming months and years to come where that part of the segment is going to experience rapid growth.
Okay. Thanks, John. That was more specific to the nuclear business, so let me ask if there are other questions. I thought I saw another hand go up in the audience, the live audience. George, do we have any chat questions? No chat questions. I do have a technical question for John about nuclear power. The new 10th generation reactor that you described in your talk, 300 megawatt units, how do they compare in terms of the requirement for cooling? Boiling water reactors have typically required a lot of cooling, typically from a water resource that's quite substantial. So how do these new reactors compare in terms of their need to be located near a cooling water source?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and certainly an advantage of this 10th generation reactor, given that it's smaller. We actually don't require a water source for cooling. There is an approach where you can use air cooling, so this can be installed in regions either where there's water scarcity, or if the water, in some cases may not, you may not have the volumes and the temperature. Now, if you switch over to air cooling, there is a penalty that you will take in terms of the output. So generally, what we anticipate is that an air-cooled system, you would lose about 20% of the output. So it would be about a 240 megawatt system. In some warmer regions, you may take even a greater penalty. So it is an option that we're in discussions with especially regions that have water scarcity.
Okay. All right, thank you. I think Marilyn Catterell has another question for us.
The question is specific to, I guess, Justin Swan and John Ball. It's about uranium and lithium in terms of mining for either of these. Are there concerns that either of you have about the future of those resources or the ability to mine for them? I'm sure this covers various geographies.
I'll go ahead and start with uranium, and it is a great question as we think about the global market. Uranium is a highly abundant element in the Earth's crust. It's also very abundant in the ocean. We have a significant amount of uranium in in North America, and especially in Canada. Cameco is one of the world leading producers, miners of uranium. And in the U.S. also has, and many of these mines, because the nuclear industry and the demand really hasn't reached its full potential. We're going to see significant growth. So I think we're going to see a lot of these mines either reopen or there'll be some new exploration. But there is a significant amount of the natural resource here, and then other friendly countries like Australia as well. Now, ultimately, that uranium then needs to be taken, and the natural uranium, and it needs to be enriched. So increasing the concentration, if you will, of the uranium-235 isotope, which is what provides the fission in a reactor. And it's that part of our supply chain in the U.S. where we need to reestablish leadership in the world. Through the years, we have depended on other countries. There is capability in Europe, including the UK, for enrichment, but not enough to serve the Western world. The Russians, the Chinese have significant enrichment capability. We have the know-how. We just need to reestablish, reinvest in those capabilities in the U.S. to meet the global demand.
Okay. Do we have either Justin still with us?
Yep.
Good.
I think I heard the question on lithium abundance and sourcing it. As with any limited natural resource, it is something that we need to be aware of and monitor and look after as we sort of roll out battery storage. The majority of lithium mined globally at the moment comes from Australia, I believe. And then you've got, I think Chile is producing quite a lot, Argentina. I'm less certain from there on, but I think Germany is about to start ramping up its production of lithium. The lithium abundance itself, as far as I'm aware, is not of huge concern right now. And I think part of that is we somewhat expect over time other technologies to become viable. I think sodium batteries are talked about and might be a few years away, but hopefully could offer a lot of the same benefits of lithium-ion batteries, but with a more abundant base material in the sodium. But I think traditionally lithium-ion batteries have also been, I think the chemistry is lithium, nickel, cobalt, or I'm sure someone out there is shaking their head at my chemical knowledge here, but it was the cobalt and the nickel mining, I think, which is of sort of the most concern, and where that's being mined and the conditions which it's being mined under. And I think from that we've seen a transitioning to other chemistry. So I think at the moment it's LFP, which is I think it's lithium iron phosphate, something like that. Again, I'm getting a bit out of my box here, but those minerals aren't as contested in terms of how they're produced. Lithium, again, there are concerns in some of the methods of processing it, and that, as I say, is something we need to be cognizant of and make sure that as studies are done in this, if there's anything uncovered in the way it gets produced, we need to be aware of that, and we need to deal with it. We can't turn a blind eye to it.
All right, thank you. Do we have other questions? I like to give everyone else a fair chance before I step to the front of the line. I have another question, again, sort of technical, but it applies to each of these sources of power. It's easy to start something, and I'm wondering about the lifespan of each kind of unit that we have talked about deploying, whether it's nuclear, batteries, or wind power. how long do these machines live before we have to replace them or renovate them? Let me start with Carly.
Yep, that's a great question. So when we're talking about offshore wind and the technology that's going to be deployed for this next wave of projects, the lifespan is about 25 to 30 years for a project. And I think it's important to note there that as part of the regulatory process through the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the developers have to indicate what they are going to do to maintain and decommission those turbines at the end of their lifespan. And I think it's also really important to note that there's a huge conversation around recyclability of turbines. About 95% of a turbine is recyclable because most of it is steel. The hardest part to recycle is the blades because they're actually a composite material. But all the major developers in the United States have made commitments to research and recycle their blades by the time this next wave of projects comes on shore.
Okay, great. John?
Yeah, the new standard for nuclear is 60 years, and that's at the initial licensing phase. Every reactor that's operating today in the U.S. was originally licensed for 40 years. Each of them have received an extension to 60. Now, those reactors, and there's a handful, are going through an extension to 80 years. So what we've learned a lot in the industry, so we now know that the baseline licensing process going forward will be 60 years, but likely the ability to relicense to 80 or perhaps even 100. So as we actually talk about, when we talk to customers, we talk about for a new nuclear plant being deployed, it's a 100-year relationship.
Wow. Okay, good. And let me poke Justin Swan with that question about batteries, about which I'm a little...
Not as clean an answer because batteries, they don't necessarily just, their life doesn't necessarily come to an end, but they degrade. So like your cell phone, over time, its charge time, its life, the usage time reduces. So that's the same with grid scale batteries. It'll degrade over its life, and then you've got options. You can continually top up the battery, so add more cells basically, and then to keep your battery at its original capacity. And in cases like that, it's basically how long your equipment lasts, how long the market lasts, and how long you want to run it for, but that might be 25 years or so. If you just let the batteries degrade over time, it's going to lose capacity over its life, but you can run it, I think, conservative. Well, you would likely, for commercial reasons, replace things, but anywhere between 10 and 20 years or so, depending on your commercial considerations.
Okay, thank you. Another opportunity for other questions, either from the live audience or the chat folks. Do we have any? We have no questions yet from the folks online. All right. I think that may do it. All right, let me thank our panelists. You've all been very informative and you've kept to your time limits. Let me thank the audience. You've been respectful and have asked questions. And let me thank again the Wilmington Sister Cities program for hosting this panel. Thank you and goodbye.